says that you're not able to deliver us from his wrath. And Hezekiah prayed, and we know the story, that God caused the king of Assyria to go back to Assyria, and his forces, his many, many horses and chariots, were destroyed. In fact, they destroyed each other because God had caused them to have confusion of mind. And so the Assyrians learned of the wrath of God. Nebuchadnezzar also defied God. He knew not God. I know not God. And we know the story of the Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar built a mighty statue, a golden image, and he commanded all the people and nations, when they heard the music of the flute and the harp and the dulcimer and the palmistry, they would fall down and worship this image, showing that Nebuchadnezzar was a great king. But we see 3 teenage boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down. Now we know that Nebuchadnezzar had taken these young men and had brought them from Jerusalem into the temple, into his kingdom, and had fed them with the best that he had, and had given them the lifestyle, many, many rich clothes, and had lavished many riches on them, and power, position. And now these boys were going to give him trouble. Everyone was bowing down to this image. And yet these 3 boys, whom he had not brought into his land for slaves, but he had taken them into his palace and had given them position and power, had clothed them with wonderful robes, rich jewels and things. And yet, because of some god, they refused to bow down to this image. Nebuchadnezzar came to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he said, now look, I've given you all these riches, I've taken you in, I've given you the best of the land, I've given you authority, and now you're refusing to obey an order? What God is this that can give you more than I've given you? What God is this that you would disobey me and learn and do what he tells you to do? But the scripture tells us that when Nebuchadnezzar spoke, he said, now if you be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, palmistry, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if you do not worship, you shall be cast that same hour into a fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of the burning fiery furnace and out of my hands? The scripture tells us that Daniel spoke up and said, O king, I'm not careful to answer you. I don't have to be careful to answer you. For I have a God in heaven that is able to deliver me. and he's able to deliver me out of your hands. But even if he doesn't deliver me, I know he's able to. But even if he doesn't deliver me, I will not bow down to your image. And so the three teenagers stood while the entire nation bowed. They stood on the principles of the living God and refused to bow down. And you know the story. They were cast into the fiery furnace. And the sacred scriptures tells us that not a hair of their head was singed. Their clothes didn't even have the smell of fire. And they stepped out of the fiery furnace. And then Nebuchadnezzar became acquainted with God. I know not God. Ignorance of God can be a terrible thing. Thoughts of this world, thoughts of the surrounding planets, thoughts of the universe, the rivers and the mighty mountains should bring to our minds an image of an all-powerful and all-knowing God. For we realize that God created the universe. God made all this. Man has been trying for years through science to disprove God. And yet, man cannot explain how the world came into existence. Man cannot explain how the rivers flow and only go so far. Man cannot explain the stars in the universe because they know not God and they do not accept his holy scriptures. I want to tell you about one more king, and this was a king of Judah, one of the tribes of Judah, Jehoshaphat. He knew God, but not enough to be acquainted to surrender his will to the will of God. 2 Chronicles 19:2 tells us that Jehoshaphat knew not God. Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, he didn't know him in trusting and believing and having confidence in him. For the scripture tells us that he made leagues with Ahab, the king of Israel, to fight against Assyria. Even though the prophet of God had came and told him that if he went against Assyria, he would be destroyed. But he made a league with Ahab. Ahab talked him into going against the king of Assyria. But when Jehoshaphat returned, Ahab had been killed, but his life was spared. 2 Chronicles 19:2 tells us, and Jehu the son of Hilkiah, the seer, went out to meet him and said to Jehoshaphat, why have you decided to help the ungodly and love them that hate God? In other words, why have you made league with Ahab to disobey God? King of Judah.